There are occurrences that transpire so abruptly that we find ourselves on the brink of astonishment and disorientation, uncertain of how to react in that instant. Such an incident befell me on a Thursday evening when the house was tranquil. My spouse had departed on a business excursion, leaving me to confront the void and solitude that persisted throughout the week. I resolved to seek some leisure for myself, shut the door, and allow the personal space to envelop me. But at that very moment, the click of the door resonated, disrupting the serene ambience. The door suddenly swung open, the light from the corridor flooded in, startling me. In that instant, I was paralyzed, speechless. A surge of humiliation, vulnerability, and mortification welled up, imprinting an indelible mark on my heart. My name is Zelda. I am 30 years of age, and I am presently experiencing a life that many deem flawless. My husband Ezekiel holds an executive position in a prominent corporation. He is not only prosperous in his profession but also a spouse who cherishes me deeply. Our existence, at least superficially, has consistently been the envy of many. A lovely home, a fulfilling life, and a love that everyone considers a dream come true. Yet, you are aware that even in the most impeccable narratives, there remain concealed aspects that no one perceives, and in our marital life, there is one element that invariably leaves me feeling discontented, difficult to articulate. Ezekiel is an occupied individual. He not only labors diligently but also aspires for the couple's future. Since our nuptials, I have grown accustomed to his recurrent absences from home, extended business voyages, and conferences that stretch into the late hours. I continually reassure myself that this is essential for his vocation and also for our shared future. Initially, I was exceedingly proud to have such a thriving husband. Each time he returned from business expeditions, his gaze was always brimming with affection, and his tender gestures sufficed to bridge the gap. The nascent days of our union were blissful. We frequently spent time together, sharing every aspect of our lives. He listened to me, and I too endeavored to ensure his comfort whenever he returned home. Despite his demanding schedule, Ezekiel always strove to arrange outings and romantic evenings for us. I felt like the most fortunate woman alive. Nevertheless, as time elapsed, the rhythm of life appeared to shift. Ezekiel, my spouse, grew increasingly engrossed in his work. He frequently embarked on business trips, and meetings consumed his days, affording him scarcely any time at home. His absences escalated day by day, and even upon his return, he often carried the burdens of his work. I comprehended his relentless efforts, not solely for himself, but also for our future. Yet, despite my understanding, I could not dismiss the growing emptiness in my heart. Besides his work, what troubled me most was the issue between us. Every night, Ezekiel, being considerably older than me, found his vigor waning. The intimacy we once shared no longer felt complete, and he too seemed aware of it. I dared not voice my feelings nor hold him accountable, but this sense of loss weighed heavily on my heart. As a woman with rather elevated emotional and physical needs, I yearn for the bond between husband and wife. However, the reality is that he is no longer robust enough to fulfill me. When Ezekiel was away, the house felt eerily vacant and chilly, so quiet that I could hear the ticking clock and the rustling leaves outside. Solitary dinners, lengthy nights in the expansive bed, everything amplified my loneliness. I attempted various means to alleviate that feeling, from immersing myself in literature, practicing yoga, indulging in retail therapy, to attending classes. Yet, these pursuits only offered fleeting distractions. As night descended, loneliness infiltrated every crevice of my soul like an inescapable shadow. I refrained from blaming Ezekiel, knowing he loved me and exerted every effort. Still, this did little to assuage the emptiness in my heart. I longed for the closeness, the intimacy we shared in the early days of our marriage. The tender gazes, the whispers in my ear now seemed mere memories. I hesitated to reveal my true feelings, fearing it might wound him or intensify his stress. Yet, this silence only drove us further apart. I am at a loss on how to bridge this chasm, My endeavors to keep occupied are merely transient remedies. Gazing into the mirror, I see a woman wearied not by labor or life, but by the void in her soul. Is there a means to draw him closer, or must I endure this concealed loneliness eternally? I am reluctant to surrender, yet I am uncertain where to commence repairing the fading connection. When Ezekiel informed me that his stepson Xavier would be returning from overseas, I experienced a blend of intrigue and apprehension. Xavier was nearing 27, just a few years my junior, and Ezekiel's offspring from a prior marriage. However, I had never encountered him, as Xavier had resided and studied abroad since our union. Ezekiel always spoke of Xavier with pride, and I understood their close father-son bond, despite infrequent meetings. The day Xavier returned, the house seemed infused with new energy. He was tall, possessed a handsome visage, and a warm smile that easily evoked affection. From our initial encounter, Xavier made me feel at ease with his courteous demeanor and witty remarks. The usually quiet household atmosphere suddenly became more vibrant. Ezekiel was elated to have Xavier back, and so was I. Xavier's presence was like a breath of fresh air, helping to alleviate my sense of emptiness. When Ezekiel was often away on business trips, Xavier swiftly integrated into our domestic life. Family meals were no longer as cold. Instead, they were filled with cheerful laughter. I realized that Xavier's presence made me feel less lonely. He often assisted me with minor household tasks, occasionally bringing joy with fascinating tales of his life abroad. However, an incident occurred that rendered the dynamic between Xavier and me awkward. That day, Ezekiel embarked on another business trip, leaving Xavier and me at home. After dinner, I took an early shower to prepare for bed. As soon as I stepped out, I wrapped a towel around myself, my hair still damp. I neglected to lock the bathroom door, assuming Xavier was in the living room. Suddenly, the door swung open. Xavier stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes wide with surprise. I, too, was paralyzed, unsure of how to react. In my panic, my hand inadvertently tugged the towel, and before I knew it, it slipped off. That moment lasted mere seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Xavier quickly averted his gaze, his face flushed, stammering an apology. "I'm sorry, I didn't know you were here," he muttered, his voice trembling. He hastily departed, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, my heart racing, a mix of embarrassment and confusion surging through me. I hurriedly secured the towel, repeatedly chastising myself for my carelessness. From that day forward, the dynamic between Xavier and me shifted irreversibly. He averted his gaze whenever our paths crossed, and I couldn't bring myself to look him directly in the eyes. The ambience between us grew tense, although Ezekiel remained oblivious. What bewildered me most was the emotion stirring within my heart. I couldn't stop reflecting on that moment in the bathroom. The recollection of Xavier's bashful glance and the unexpected incident lingered in my mind, evoking both embarrassment and exhilaration. I chastised myself for these thoughts, but I couldn't deny that post-incident, my attention was increasingly drawn to Xavier. Occasionally, I would catch sight of him traversing the hallway, and my heart would race. I attempted to maintain a facade of normalcy, yet deep down, an inexplicable sensation persisted. I understood that I shouldn't reveal this feeling. Ezekiel was the man I cherished, the one who had bestowed upon me his utmost trust. However, whenever Ezekiel was absent, and it was just Xavier and me at home, the initial discomfort gradually gave way to a sentiment I dared not acknowledge. The turmoil within me rendered indifference impossible. Xavier, too, maintained a cautious distance. I observed that he deliberately avoided being alone with me, which only amplified my confusion. I couldn't forget the expression in his eyes that day in the bathroom, a mix of bewilderment and something unspoken. I reassured myself that it was merely an accident, that normality would eventually resume, but it didn't. The more I attempted to dismiss the memory, the more I found myself ensnared in peculiar thoughts. As time progressed, I felt increasingly unlike myself. I began to notice Xavier's every gesture, glance, and smile. There were instances when I deliberately orchestrated opportunities for proximity, a minor request, an extended conversation, or simply positioning myself where I knew he would pass. I couldn't rationalize my behavior, but this novel sensation was akin to a smoldering ember I didn't wish to extinguish. In Xavier's eyes, I sometimes glimpsed a look of perplexity tinged with curiosity. I wondered if he sensed something amiss in me. One day, Ezekiel announced a week-long business trip, leaving Xavier and me alone in the house. Initially, I convinced myself that this was just another routine absence, but deep down, I knew things had irrevocably changed since the bathroom incident. An indefinable tension lingered between Xavier and me, intertwined with a conflict I was reluctant to admit. One afternoon, I decided to ask Xavier to assist with repairing a cabinet in my bedroom. Although not urgent, I wanted to gauge his reaction. When Xavier entered the room, I deliberately wore a more revealing and comfortable outfit than usual. I stood close to him, intentionally creating moments of fleeting contact, a brief touch, a lingering glance. Xavier looked at me, his eyes slightly confused, yet he maintained his composure. My heart pounded, aware that this moment was testing our boundaries. "Just leave it here," he said softly but firmly. He swiftly completed the task and stepped back, maintaining a safe distance. "Do you need anything else?" he inquired, avoiding my gaze. I shook my head, feigning calm, but as Xavier exited without looking back, I felt a mix of disappointment and bewilderment. Each night, when Ezekiel called, I strove to sound normal, concealing my inner turmoil. Yet, after each call, the gnawing feeling in my heart intensified. I knew my thoughts and actions were transgressing boundaries, but despite my rational mind's protests, Xavier's image persistently invaded my thoughts. The awkward bathroom encounter, our cautious interactions, all resurfaced whenever I closed my eyes. I couldn't help but think of him each time we accidentally met in the house, my heart racing. Xavier, too, seemed altered, less talkative, his eyes evasive whenever we crossed paths. Yet, in fleeting moments, I sensed he wasn't entirely indifferent. Perhaps he, too, grappled with his feelings, or maybe it was my imagination, justifying my growing emotions. But one night, all boundaries between Xavier and me shattered completely. It was a Thursday, nearly a week since Ezekiel's departure, and the house felt quieter than ever. The silence was oppressive, like a smoldering fire within me, causing suffocation and emptiness. Married life had never felt so lonely. Ezekiel's business trips weren't unusual, but this time, the void seemed insurmountable, a profound disconnect between husband and wife. I lay in bed, attempting to sleep, but a burning desire consumed me. The longing intensified, and I realized I couldn't endure it any longer. A daring thought crossed my mind, and before I could stop myself, I reached for my phone, turning on the screen. I searched for films to alleviate my rising desire, telling myself it was merely a means to fill the void and dispel loneliness. I immersed myself in the images, my emotions escalating, each moment drawing me into a trance, oblivious to my surroundings. I surrendered to my feelings, seeking ecstasy. I forgot to lock the door, perhaps no longer caring about anything but relieving my heart's frustration. After a week away from my husband, I needed to fill the void within me. Just as my emotions peaked, the bedroom door suddenly opened. I froze, the hallway light illuminating the room, revealing Xavier standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. For a few seconds, we stared at each other, speechless. I quickly pulled the blanket over my exposed body, my heart pounding with fear and shame. "I apologize," Xavier faltered, his gaze instantly dropping to the floor. He swiftly shut the door and departed, leaving me alone with my tumultuous emotions. As the door closed, I remained seated, my entire body quivering. I lost track of time, overwhelmed by the confusion and mortification that seemed to permeate the room. Abruptly, the door reopened before I could regain my composure. Xavier entered, his eyes reflecting both bewilderment and resolve. I jolted, my heart racing, a mix of fear and embarrassment surging through me. I hastily drew the blanket to conceal my body. Xavier, what are you doing? I asked, my voice trembling. Leave, this can't happen. But Xavier remained silent. He approached, his eyes locked onto mine, as if attempting to pierce through every barrier I tried to erect. Before I could react, Xavier sat on the bed, mere inches away, his hands slightly trembling, yet still touching my shoulders. Does Dad not satisfy you? He inquired, his voice low but probing and self-tormenting. His question left me frozen. I shook my head, struggling to maintain my fragile composure. No, it's not like that, Xavier. This shouldn't happen, we can't, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Xavier moved closer, his gaze unwavering. You're enticing me, aren't you? Your eyes, your gestures, everything betrays it. Or perhaps you need me. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words refused to come out. My body tensed, unable to respond, and my eyes, despite my efforts to avoid his, were drawn to him. As if reading my thoughts, Xavier leaned in, wrapped his arms around my waist, and pulled me into his embrace. The warmth of his body disarmed me, rendering me incapable of resistance. I trembled, but did not push him away nor utter another word. You don't need to say anything, just look at me and I'll know, his voice whispered in my ear, gentle yet igniting a fire that consumed all my defenses. I wanted to push him away, but instead, my hands unconsciously tightened around his arms. The conflict within me vanished completely as his lips met mine, gentle yet intense. In that moment, all reason crumbled. I knew I was transgressing, aware that this was wrong, yet I couldn't stop. We melded together, words failing to describe the surging emotions. The hallway light filtered through the door crack, witnessing the dissolution of all barriers between us. When it was over, I lay quietly in his arms, my body and mind a whirlwind of mixed emotions. Regret began to seep in, accompanied by an indescribable feeling of having crossed a point of no return. I didn't know how I would face tomorrow, but at that moment, all I knew was that the boundary between Xavier and me had been irrevocably erased. From that day forward, all the boundaries that had existed between Xavier and me vanished entirely. We no longer exchanged shy glances or evasive gestures. Each time we met, our eyes held a silent understanding, even as we continued to live under the same roof as stepmother and stepson. Our private moments made us feel like a genuine couple. Xavier became the one who filled the emotional and physical void within me. Every look, every touch, every word seemed to compensate for what was lacking in my marriage to Ezekiel. But I knew this feeling couldn't last forever, and indeed, it didn't. One day, Xavier announced his return abroad to complete his studies. The news hit me like a bucket of ice water. Outwardly, I remained composed, but internally, the sense of loss was profound. I tried to maintain a calm demeanor, but with each passing day, the thought of Xavier's departure weighed heavier on my heart. The day Xavier left, the house was filled with an atmosphere of regret. Ezekiel and I accompanied him to the airport. Before entering the check-in area, Xavier embraced Ezekiel, then turned to me. I held him a bit longer than usual. Ezekiel stood smiling, perhaps thinking my affection stemmed from familial bonds, but only Xavier and I understood the true depth of that embrace. Take care of yourself, Xavier whispered in my ear, his voice choked but attempting calm. I said nothing, just held him tighter, as if trying to hold onto the fleeting moments. As he walked away, I felt an emptiness within. When Xavier left, the house fell into an uncanny hush. I resumed my daily routine with Ezekiel, but the sense of void lingered. Initially, I was like a specter in the house, performing tasks mechanically. I tried to reassure myself that time would mend my feelings, but the truth was that the chasm left by Xavier was more profound than I had anticipated. During the interminable nights, lying beside Ezekiel, I felt entrapped. Although Ezekiel still cherished and cared for me, his affection was no longer sufficient to fill the void I felt. I recognized that I couldn't continue this way. One evening after dinner, I resolved to have an open conversation with Ezekiel. I didn't mention Xavier, but confessed my emotions. Ezekiel, I started, my voice quavering slightly. I feel like we've been growing distant. You're always consumed by work, and I feel adrift. Sometimes, I feel utterly alone in this marriage. Ezekiel set down his utensils, his eyes brimming with remorse. I'm sorry, Zelda, he replied, his tone genuine. I hadn't realized you were hurting like this. Work has demanded so much of my time, and I haven't given you the attention you deserve. I don't hold it against you, I said softly. But I believe we need to make changes, or else I fear we can't keep living this way. Ezekiel remained silent for a prolonged moment before taking my hand and giving it a reassuring squeeze. You're right. I've been so absorbed in work that I forgot family is what matters most. I promised to change. I wasn't sure how enduring that promise would be, but I felt relieved to have voiced my thoughts. A few days later, Ezekiel informed me he was resigning from his job. I've toiled for years and saved enough for us to live comfortably, he explained. I want to dedicate the rest of my time to making amends and truly enjoying our life together. His decision surprised me, but I was also thankful. Ezekiel finally comprehended my needs and was willing to transform for me. In the ensuing days, Ezekiel was more present at home. We took strolls, cooked together, and spent long evenings conversing like we did in the early days of our union. Though there were still concealed recesses in my heart I couldn't reveal, Ezekiel's presence somewhat assuaged the void within me. I didn't know what the future held, but for now, I felt I could find solace with the man I had chosen. After Xavier's departure, my life slowly returned to its usual cadence. Ezekiel, staying true to his word, devoted more time to me. He was home more often, caring for me with genuine love and affection. We experienced tranquil days, attempting to reconstruct our frayed bond. Yet, deep down, I knew the fissures in my heart wouldn't easily mend. Xavier lingered like a phantom in my memories, a reminder of my transgressions. I once believed that assuaging my loneliness would bring happiness, but reality proved otherwise. The burden of guilt and inner turmoil was the toll for my indiscretion. There were nights I gazed at Ezekiel, sleeping peacefully beside me, and pondered if I deserved his love. The answer was invariably no. My blunder had rendered our marriage more fragile than ever. Ezekiel, oblivious to what had transpired, loved me wholeheartedly. As for me, despite my best efforts, I couldn't erase the feeling of having shattered our most sacred trust. In retrospect, I realized my gravest error was not being candid about my feelings and needs from the outset. Loneliness and emptiness aren't justifications for trespassing boundaries, regardless of the circumstances. I should have communicated with Ezekiel earlier instead of allowing solitude to misguide me. Marriage necessitates not only love but also comprehension and sharing. Evading and silencing problems only causes relationships to gradually fracture, creating openings for misguided emotions to intrude. Be forthright with your partner if you feel lonely. Confide in and share with them. Addressing the issue is the sole path to resolution. Learn to cherish yourself. Don't let emptiness engulf you, and find wholesome ways to care for yourself, such as reading, acquiring new skills, or connecting with friends. Uphold moral boundaries regardless of the situation. Remember, a moment of frailty can demolish a relationship. Treasure what you possess, and always ponder the repercussions before acting. Marriage is a voyage of learning and growth. If given another chance, I would opt for the path of sincerity and fortitude to confront the issue rather than allowing errors to dictate my life. Heartaches can be costly lessons, but don't let them become lessons that forfeit your joy.